I've got a little bit of realia for you. I've got, well, it's not little, it's huge, a huge ginger root. And I'm going to give you a creative thinking question for you to ponder during my session about the ginger root. How might this ginger root be a metaphor for creating materials for creative responses? So that's just something for you to ponder now, and all will be revealed during the session. So just keep in mind that ginger root. Okay, so this is my menu for you this morning or this afternoon or this evening. First of all then, what are the foundations of creativity when we think about picture books in primary English language teaching specifically? Then, our very familiar pre, while, post framework, so very familiar in primary ELT for skills teaching, and what are the possibilities and what is the potential for creating materials with that framework. Then thinking about so-called in-between spaces and maybe looking perhaps critically at pre, while and post. And then I'd like to use creatively artography. Now, artography is often referred to as a research method. And as a PhD candidate, like all PhD candidates, I'm very much have research methods on the brain at the moment. And I did a course very recently in arts-based research and methodology, and artography spoke to me, and I thought, wow, that's amazing, and it could really help our work in primary ELT when creating materials. So I'm bringing artography to you today. Some of you may be familiar with artography, some of you might be new. And then finally, I'd like to share some sample creative creations which build on the other things that I'm looking at in this session. All right. So then, what do I mean when I refer to creativity? Because obviously it's been defined in many ways. And I'd like to link to Carol Reed. So for those of you who are at her very clear and very, she really richly unpacked the intercultural domain yesterday in a really clear way, and a way that has a lot of resonance, I think, for practitioners and teacher educators. We're drawing on Reed's freely downloadable chapter on creativity, her 7 pillars. And these are the elements or the creative ingredients involved. She talks about thinking out of the box, coming up with fresh ideas. So that's such a key one, isn't it, for creativity? This one, I think we really often don't do enough of in primary ELT for many, many reasons. Welcoming divergent responses. So often a response, for it to be creative, needs to be a little bit out there, I think. Developing original ideas and objects, perhaps we could call an ICE kit, an original idea and an object. Devising new solutions to address challenges. I think the entire intercultural domain in primary English language teaching is a challenge in and of itself, and creativity can help there. And looking at issues from different perspectives, so important for intercultural learning. And so creative materials design can really help with that too. Okay, so taking those key ingredients, what are our foundations then? Well, using creativity with picture books in primary ELT, we've got to there has to be something to stimulate creativity. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum, and sadly, doesn't often happen in a course book, I have to say, in my view. But picture books, and I think we've been discovering throughout our symposium, particularly picture books with intercultural themes, can really stimulate original thought, because we're bringing in concepts, lives, worlds, identities, ideas that children maybe haven't reflected on deeply, had any opportunity to reflect on, to work around in their English learning. Also, that sparking creativity, the need for an emotional response and involvement. And we often talk in primary ELT about the importance of personalization, But for something to be truly personalized, I think there does need to be an emotional feeling towards the book, a feeling toward the characters, a feeling toward the settings, the plot, and so on. And sorry, mediation then. So Gail and Sandy talked really passionately and very usefully about mediation yesterday in terms of read aloud. And building on that idea of the scaffolding and the support and the kind of tasks and activities we create around picture books, how are we going to mediate that? And I think for primary ELT, we're thinking about the creative ideas, but also the language support. So creatively marrying the two things and giving examples can really help children feel they can achieve that, they can have a go, they can take risks, and materials design can very much support that. And then the time, and I think this is such one of the biggest barriers. Teachers say, we don't have time, and often that's very much the case. And so how can we, through our materials, and save time for them? And I think producing these kits and then disseminating them offers teachers all over the world, actually, a way that they can save time in terms of preparation because they can adapt. And when we want to be creative, we need time to reflect and to ponder. I think that's such a key word when it comes to picture books, because, just flicking through a picture book, there's so much we're going to miss. So is there time for the child to interact with the verbal and the visual text, to think about that and to respond to that? And then really important when we're fostering creativity, to not fall down that route about innate talent. This child is very artistic. I'm certainly not artistic, but I love art and I love being creative. So I think focusing on the creative effort made rather than, some so-called natural creative talent. So that's bringing together creativity with picture books in primary ELT. Okay. So these are just a couple of the picture books then from the project. And I'm not sure whether Sandy mentioned, I'm sure she did, in our list of possibilities for the teachers on the project and the student teachers, there's around 45 titles. And these are just two of my favorites. I have so many favorites. Clean Up by Nathan Bryan and Dapo Adiola, and Malala's Magic Pencil by Malala. So imagine I'm going to use these picture books, or any teacher says, okay, so in my primary English lessons, I'm going to use those picture books. Well, what would be my organizing framework for my lesson, for my series of lessons? And I think this is where we evolve to, rely on, draw on, use the pre, while, and post skill framework, essentially, in ELT for reading, for listening, and for other skills as well. So thinking about those roots being the pre, what we do to set up, often pre-teaching vocabulary, problematic in itself. The while, often dominated by comprehension and closed questions with particular answers. So I think a little problematic for creativity. And the post, well, creativity, I think at the planning stage is often meant to take place in the post, but then the time factor comes in and the logistic factors come in, and sometimes those post activities are the first things to go. So today in my session, I want to problematize pre, while, and post. I don't want to throw it away and say it doesn't have any purpose, but I think when we're wanting to create creative materials and engage children creatively with picture books, we need to think a little bit critically about this very relied on framework, perhaps overly relied on. Okay. Why do I think it leads to a lot of creativity? Well, this is what Janice Bland calls deeper reading for in-depth learning. Now, interpretive responses, if we're wanting to give children an opportunity for them to respond personally to the characters in the picture book, to the plot, to the setting, and show feelings and trigger emotions and interest and curiosity, we need to foster deep reading approaches, as Janice Bland called them, rather than the comprehension focus, the yes, no, the right, wrong, the answer key. And for something like interculturality and intercultural learning, that the depth is necessary. It's complex, it's rich, it's multifaceted, it's plural. Also, the predictability. And I think, you know, if children really know what's coming next, I mean, we talk about the importance of routines. And I'm not saying that in primary ELT we should ditch our routines. However, at the same time, if we want children to get creative, and if there needs to be an element of the exploration side, so we're not just adding another text, but we're helping children connect at a deep level to the plot and the characters in order that they can go on and be creative. Talk about comprehension questions, and it really reminds me of, you know, Grinder's work in the 60s, that, you know, the culture of right answerism. And I bring that up today because I think it is so alive and kicking and so strong and so dominant in classrooms at all levels, all over the world, in, you know, that I have seen. And so I think this is such a barrier, and the comprehension questions, those true falses, are such a barrier to creativity. And as I said earlier, it's often the first thing that goes. If the creative is relegated to the post-task, the post-stage of the lesson, it's often the thing that's lost. So children's creative agency, chances to explore, oh, we've run out of time, we'll have to move on to the next thing in our syllabus. So there are lots of problems, I think, if we rely on this framework in a formulaic way. Okay, so as Sandy has often described the picture book as an interanimation of images and words. So the meaning is conveyed and the concepts are conveyed and those intercultural themes are conveyed through and between the images and the words. And I want us to really think now about those spaces in between. If we are working with an aesthetic object like a picture book, I think we really do need to transcend that pre-while post framework, and we need some other tools and concepts and framework and ideas to help us. And I'd like you to ponder this image now. So, the coming together of a forest and a meadow. So very, very different. All that lush vegetation and then the flat meadow coming together. And what happens when it comes together? What's that in between, the interstice? And that's really what I'm interested in, and really interested in the creative potential. And I think for intercultural learning, the forest and the meadow metaphor is also a powerful one, of the plurality of culture, the complexity of cultures, how cultures are nuanced, coming together. And that's where there's such potential for learning through picture books, if we can create materials which evoke a creative response. And this is where artography really, really speaks to me. It builds on the work of Irwin and Springay in particular, and it really captures or centers that interstice. And I'm calling it here in the vibrant interstice. And in its original conception, it is the triangular relationship between the artist, as in the A, the researcher, as in the R, and the teacher, which I put at the top, so pivotal, so crucial and important in creating materials, and the bringing together. And this really, really inspired me when I started looking and reading and writing about artography and applying it to picture books, because I thought this is such a wonderful conceptual framework that we can bring into teacher education, and also we can bring into teaching. And that's what I'm going to try to do in this session today. So, why I believe artography works for us when we want to create materials for children's creative responses in primary English language teaching. So we've got the blend of the three, and we're focusing on the in-between. And I think picture books with intercultural themes, that's actually what it's all about. It's exploring, concretizing, unpacking the in-between in a way which is accessible to children based on their ages, based on their interests, based on their contexts, and also based on their English. And it very much links to what I think is very exciting and very rich is the growing focus on action research. And this is where the researcher is not just someone going into the classroom, observing and leaving. It's teachers themselves. It's empowering. So it's wanting to improve and change practice. So it's a practice-led research, which I, as someone who's come from practice newly into academia, this really speaks to me as well. And it really helps me to marry these two often separate worlds. And very important for interculturality, it really prioritizes, recognizes and celebrates multiple identities and goes beyond that linear tree-type image. Important for children who are learning English and have different proficiency levels. Thinking about the ICEPELL project, we have children as young as 5 in classes and maybe with very little English. And so we need materials which enable them to respond in ways that don't only rely on language. And then very importantly is this evocative. We need to evoke a response for creativity to happen, and also the transformative nature of art. Because we often talk about concepts such as shifting perspective, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. But for that to happen, I feel very strongly for children learning English, they need something concrete, a vehicle, an evocative vehicle, which I would say is the picture book, and the tasks and the activities and the materials the teacher uses around the picture book. So, this is a quote from Irwin, bringing those three dimensions together, the artist, the researcher, and the teacher. And I put in bold aspects that I feel are very crucial for interculturality. So that awareness-raising aspect, the encouraging an openness, capturing that complexity rather than downplaying it, and wanting to look at things differently or encourage different ways of looking. I want to make this concrete now for you and for all of us. And it's not only one person, the triangle, the artist, the researcher, and the teacher. It can be, of course, but it can also be conceived in a different way. And that's how I'm thinking of it. For me, the artist aspect is when we're bringing in the creator, the picture book creator, the picture book as the aesthetic object. The researcher, I'm seeing myself as a researcher, practice-led researcher. And also, this is a dear colleague of mine who's super passionate about using picture books in primary ELT, Griselda, in Argentina. She recently put together a piece recommending cleanup and recommending ways it could be used for action taking, which is a key element of the ICEPELL project, around the environment. So environmental action taking, and she put that together for the Keeley Journal. And so this relationship, I think, is a living example of artography in action. Okay, so now let's move on to look specifically at materials creation in PELT. The importance of encouraging imagination. So there needs to be an element of imagination in the material, for this to really work its magic. And I'd like to share an example with you from a colleague, Tasha Gruenbaum, who is one of our colleagues on the ICEPEL project, and her colleague, Miranda Timmermans in the Netherlands. Because I think this is such a brilliant example of orthography in primary English teacher education. And you can see the task there. I won't read it out for you, but it captures so many elements that I've been talking about of doing creativity, creating materials, and enabling teachers to create materials. So these are student teachers in the second and the third year of their BA in primary English ed, and they are creating their own picture book creation based on all of their learning. And I put the reference there, and I'll give you the full reference at the end. This is an example. I just chose one. I don't have time to show more, but this is such an amazing example, I think, all around. You know, everyone wants to belong somewhere, but do you always have to adapt? And this was created for youth with 3 to 6-year-old children. I just think that's amazing. And for me, that's just such a convincing example of how art can really be that brilliant vehicle for our creative materials. And in this case, it was actually creating a picture book. So creative practices there are clearly at the center of primary English teacher education programs. Inspired by the TAP, or the Adams Picture Book Project, I have tried to do that in my past semester this year with my student teachers here at Nord. It shows that materials design is seen as such an important and positive thing for student teachers and their pedagogy. It's looking at their wider educational remit, so not only developing them as language teachers, but developing them as educators. And it still keeps a focus on language, and no one's suggesting that focusing on English language isn't crucial and is part of our role, but it's doing it in a far more enriched manner. Okay, so Eisner is one of the main founding fathers of an art-based approach. And I think many of the things he says are so key to our ICEPEL project. I think the emphasis on thinking and reflection there, empathy, so important. This one for interculturality, the vicariously re-experiencing the world. And aspects of the world that are maybe not so familiar to children, or something they not. I don't want us to always assume that not familiar to children, but not that they may not have had an opportunity to explore in the primary English classroom. And now I want to focus the last part on the ICEPEL project and how it brings the triangle together. So as Sandy mentioned in her opening today, I had the pleasure of co-creating an ice kit with Tasha Gruenbaum and Anna Nunge on Perfectly Norman. So this is our picture book, and the idea is that teachers will co-create the materials. There's still the emphasis there on the teacher, and this is the ice kit. So this is an example of the artographical approach, in my view, coming together, fusing together creatively. Okay, so a community of inquiry, and that's very much what we're trying to do. We're trying to work transnationally across borders on our creative materials. Heavily collaborative and very much embodied experiences. So we want the children to be experiential around interculturality. As I mentioned earlier, the emotional response is so important for evoking creativity. This has been thought about throughout these ice kits. I think an ice kit in itself is very innovative. And the action-taking element, and this is perhaps the most challenging aspect of fostered through creative materials. And I think it's something that in primary English language teaching, when we explore the intercultural domain, it's an area we need to focus a lot more on as teacher educators, as academics, and as practitioners. So coming back to our ginger root then, how are we doing for time hiding? Okay.
You
So
still have about 15 minutes.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. So just in time for the ginger root. So working orthographically with Picturebooks to move beyond that very entrenched pre, while, and post. How can we do that then? And I'm going to give some examples initially from the ICEPELL project, and then I'll end with my own student teachers, because here at Nord, because I've been able to do a lot with them, despite the remote teaching, despite all the challenges, I feel, have been able to work orthographically this semester. Okay, so the first area then, or the first aspect that I think we need to consider is, well, the concept of the rhizome then. Why a rhizome? Why the ginger root? Because it doesn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end. You know, it captures in a very visually striking way the multiple entry points and really underscores metaphorically the need for creativity at all stages. It isn't just in the post, it isn't just after the activities around the book, it isn't just toward the end or the last thing or the culmination. I think ELT has a real tendency to leave the creativity toward the end. And I think that it's such a risk and there's so much potential lost. And moving beyond that toward materials where creativity comes in throughout at all angles and at all stages through our materials. So how can we make this happen? Well, the context, when we're contextualizing work around a picture book, when we're leading in, when we're getting children curious and engaged, this is such a brilliant opportunity for creativity. And I've long fostered the importance of grabbing attention, keeping attention, but really getting children questioning, wondering during the contextualization stages or lessons and so on. I think we saw a brilliant example yesterday from Gianluigi in Italy with the book, The Suitcase, the picture book, The Suitcase, whereby he brought in the suitcase, the physical suitcase, and the children were pondering, wondering, questioning, what would we put in our suitcase? They were drawing things they put in their suitcase. They were working with realia, and I thought, what an embodied, creative way to set context. Thinking about the ice kit for this picture book, Perfectly Norman by Tom Percival. So Tasha, Anna and I, we thought about, because of the feathers, I don't know if you can see those embossed feathers, Norman's wings, we thought about the feely bags and children having bags of feathers in groups and feeling and then touching with their eyes closed, guessing what's in this bag, how do these feathers relate to this story, what might happen to the character Norman, what does he do in the story? So such a creative way in. And I think creativity in our materials needs to happen from the get-go. Then, super important for ICEPELL, one of my favorite aspects that is so rare, I feel, in primary English language teaching, are the paratextual ponderings. And this is such a passion of Sandy's, particularly, that I think has been so infectious, positively infectious for the partners on this project, that we now realise the importance of working with the front cover, working with the back cover, the title page, the dedication, the dust jacket, all those aspects that make a picture book, and getting the children triggering predictions and questioning. So, for example, very quickly, if we take this one, which is one of my latest favourites, Julian at the wedding. So we see the two main characters here, Julian and Marisol. And so the children can predict, you know, what might Julian and Marisol do at the wedding? Where might the wedding be? Who might be getting married? Have you been to a wedding? And so on. So immediately we're into their life experiences, pair work, and so on in English. And then actually the children discover from the back cover that the wedding, these are the brides. So the two brides are getting married at the wedding. So from doing paratextual ponderings with the front cover and then actually revealing the back cover before we've even started sharing the picture book is, to use another term from Janice Bland, that is immediate schema refreshment. Refreshment of perception, of belief, of view, of expectation. And I think all of that acts as triggers for creative thinking, and also so key for the intercultural domain, challenging expectations through picture books. The next one, radiant read aloud. No one, in my view, could talk about read aloud better than Sandy and Gail, who had the keynote yesterday, and shared so many levels and layers and importance of read aloud talk, importance of careful questioning, and personalized questioning to evoke that emotional response to the characters' journeys, actions, the situations, the things that the characters encounter, and all of that, working deeply with that, moving away from the yes, no, true, false, right, wrong, one answer style reading, and really going deeply through radiant read aloud is a real trigger for creativity. And then, of course, the creative creation, linked and building on all of the other areas of the ginger root. And those are what I'd like to show you next, very briefly. So my student teachers have worked with many, many picture books this semester. These are three of them. I've already mentioned Julian at the Wedding. Julian at the Wedding follows Julian at the Mermaid, which some of you may have used, may know, and also Cleanup, which I mentioned earlier. So I'm just going to show you some examples of creative creations that my student teachers created here for use in primary English teaching. So this was, that was their brief. So they were following, we were working orthographically in order to produce these creative creations. And this is one of them linked to Cleanup. Very much to do with the intercultural domain, which is a big focus of our past semester as well. And this is to do with action taking and environmental action. And so in a way, what the student teacher has done here, she has recreated elements of the picture book through the action taking lens, but personalized to her own context. So here we have the idea of recycling, and you might not be able to see from the picture which looks like a tortoise, but that's all made with recycled materials. And then the what can I do cards are ideas and prompts to give choices, creative choices of environmental actions that children could take. And there you see it extended. So if I see, pollution and so on in nature. And that was her creative creation there. This one was around Julian is a mermaid and the concept of multiple plural identities. And this was making jigsaw pieces. And these were her prompts that this student teacher designed. And this is a jigsaw piece around the child's own identity, multiple as they are, and also Julian's identity. So it's reflecting deeply on the characters in a creative, interpretive way in terms of their multiple identities, Julian and Abuela and other characters in the book, and then for themselves as well. And that comes together then as that super visually striking collage display at the end. This one is a fusion, because we don't only work in our programs here with picture books, we also work at NURD with many, many children's literature formats, and this is an illustrated chapbook. And so we have Planet Omar there and Julian at the Wedding. And what really struck me about Julian at the Wedding with this student teacher is the way she's used colors, and she's retold she's recreated the picture book, but the characters are represented by different colors. And when she did her oral presentation of this, her interpretation and choices and selections of those colours was fascinating and very personalised. And for Planet Omar, she has created a collage of photographs and also drawings and pictures from the key characters as a kind of a scrapbook. And I just thought these were super evocative, very creative in terms of personalised response. So I'd just like to wrap that up with this quote from Lego et al. About the importance of part of our success as teachers in primary ELT is not simply to add another text, I feel, and not simply to go through the formulaic motions of pre, while, and post, but to really put creative approaches at the center, really capture inspiring, through picture books, inspiring stories of social action in order to encourage children themselves to take social action. And the part that I haven't mentioned and I must mention is that the ography in artography refers to writing, obviously. And what I would feel is very empowering about orthography is the way the teacher becomes part of the narrative, part of the discourse, and part of, as we saw in the Avance example, part of the dissemination. So this is my final message then around the interstice. Enable the forest to meet the meadow where interculturality and creativity can thrive. Thank you very much. So just to recap, we've thought about the foundations of creativity with picture books. We have thought critically about the pre, while, post framework. We've thought about those in-between spaces and their creative potential. We have hopefully given you some idea and hopefully ignited a bit of interest in artography for creative material design in primary ELT. And I've shared what are some of my favorite creative creations. And those are my references. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.